Right, so like when we're talking about tracts in the spinal cord, we are concerned with two things. There are tracts that are going up, that are the ascending tracts. Then we have tracts that are going down, which we call the descending tracts. Right. Generally, a tract is um, a band of axons inside the central nervous system. It's the equivalent of what we call a nerve. A nerve is a band of axons in the peripheral nervous system, right? So we have what we call the sensory pathways, then we have the motor pathways. I think that is self-explanatory. Sensory pathways, these are the pathways that are involved in sensations like crude touch, vibration, pain, and temperature. Then, of course, we'll have the sensations in the head, the special senses, which we'll not talk about in this in this talk. Then we have the motor pathways, right? So when you look at the sensory pathway usually has three neurons, right? There's what we call the first order neuron. First order neuron is the neuron that brings information from the periphery to the central nervous system. For example, if you are touched, there's going to be a first order neuron that conveys that touch information from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. Depending on the pathway, if it's the, or maybe, okay, maybe I'll talk about the specifics, but that's the first order neuron. Then the second order neuron is the one that goes to relay to the thalamus. So the last time we talked, I say that every sensation passes through the thalamus first, except the sense of smell. So every sensation passes through the thalamus first before going to the cortex, except the sense of smell. So you find that the second order neuron is the one that is going to cross and it's going to go to the thalamus. By cross, remember the last time I said that the right brain controls the left body, then the left brain controls the right body. So when you have a sensory impulse moving, it has to go to the opposite side. So it is the second order neuron that is going to take a set. And then the third order neuron is the one that leaves the thalamus and it goes to the cerebral cortex. That is now the brain, right? So you have those three sets of neurons. You can just keep that at the back of your mind. So when you look at the tracks that we want to discuss, these tracks, remember I say they're either going to be ascending or they're going to be descending, right? Then of course we have intersegmental tracks. These, you don't really need to worry about them. But for your level, you guys should know more about ascending and descending, right? So remember I said we have sensory, then we have motor. So ascending tracts are more likely going to be sensory. Why? Because you're going to carry a sensory impulse from the periphery, it ascends to the brain for interpretation. Then what is the brain going to do? The brain is going to send an impulse that goes down for motor. What is motor going to do? Motor is going to react, or basically we call it the effector response to the sensation. For example, you're walking or you're standing, then a snake walks on your leg, right? You're going to feel the sensation, then it goes to the brain, whatever. What is the brain going to do? The brain is going to perceive that as a sensation of being moved by an animal or something. So it's going to send an effector response to your lower limb muscles to promote running, something like that. It's just a layman example that I'm giving. Those are what we're going to call the descending tracts, right? But it's more than that. So if you remember the cross-sectional anatomy of the spinal cord that I told you the other time, the spinal cord has this central gray matter, which looks like an H. Then the rest of the spinal cord is the white matter, right? So when you look at this white matter, diagrams let me repeat myself or put emphasis on this. Diagrams, for example, this diagram here, they're put in this way to make life easy to understand, but they are not like this. For example, if you look at that left side here, right? The tracts that are put in this white matter on the left side, they are just ascending tracts. They have left out the descending tracts there so that you are not confused. If you go to the right side here, they've just put descending tracts, but they have not put your ascending tracts to make it easy to interpret these diagrams, right? So I'll start with the most important sensory ones. Here in the dorsal columns here, we have what we call the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. So let's use common sense. Remember the last time I said gracilis, you just remember that there was a gracilis muscle in the lower limb. So as you're adding these fibers to the spinal cord, sensory information from the lower limb has to be medial, more central. Why? Because the spinal cord is starting lower down, going up. In this sense, when you're talking about ascending tracts. So you start to add the information from the lower limbs, then you go to the pelvis, the abdomen, the thorax, then the upper limb more outside. That is why this fasciculus gracilis is more medial. It's going to carry sensations from the lower limb rather. Then the fasciculus cuneatus will carry sensations from the upper body. Right. They create what we call the dorsal white column. Right. What kind of sensations are being carried by this dorsal white column? This is going to be fine touch, vibration, and to some extent proprioception. Right. But I would want to bring your attention to that proprioception to say that we have different types of proprioception. Right. So here it says proprioception, yes, but proprioception, there is conscious proprioception. Proprioception is the position of sense for you to know that your hand is in the air. Position of sense. There is conscious, then there's unconscious. This is conscious proprioception. Right. So this dorsal column is concerned with proprioception, fine touch, which basically is discriminative touch. Right. So what happens here is this column in the spinal cord, it remains on the same side. I'm sure I talked about the clinicals the last time. This column remains on the same side as it goes up the spinal cord. It will only decussate upon entering the medulla. It decussates halfway up the medulla. We'll do that when we do the medulla. So in the medulla, it will decussate to form the internal arcuate fibers, whatever. We'll talk about that when you do the medulla, right? Then go to the contralateral side. Then remember I said the second order neuron is the one that decussates. So in the dorsal column, what I have is the first order neuron. The second order neuron is the one that decussates in the medulla to go to the thalamus. Then from the thalamus, I get a third order neuron that goes to the brain, basically. Right. This lower bunch here is just telling us what fasciculus gracilis will carry and what fasciculus cuneatus will carry. Right. Remember, fasciculus gracilis is the lower body, then fasciculus cuneatus is the upper body. Right. I'm just trying to make it simple, but then second order neurons are these ones that I say they would decussate, right? So this may be a bit deep for you since you haven't done medulla, but within the medulla, there is a nucleus gracilis and a nucleus cuneatus. It is after reaching those nuclei where the fibers are going to decussate. It is what we call the internal arcuate fibers. After they decussate as internal arcuate fibers, they will then ascend as a new system called the medial lemniscus. So when you do physiology, you find that they refer to this system as the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. The dorsal column part is the part in the spinal cord. The medial lemniscus part is the part in the brainstem. Then when they go to the thalamus, they go to specific nuclei. So I'll spare you that information since you haven't done thalamus. But remember about what I said at the time. It's very easy if you start from up going down because you understand what you're talking about, right? So just try to to understand a bit of the what's happening up in the brain. So this is just a pathway that's trying to depict what I've been telling you. This is going to be the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus on the same side in the spinal cord. Then in the medulla, it's going to synapse at the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. Then I create these fibers that are decasseting. The decasseting fibers are what we call the internal arcuate fibers. Then these internal arcuate fibers will then ascend as the medial lemniscus. There's a reason why it's called a lemniscus. There's a reason why we're calling it medial. There'll be a lateral, there'll be a spinal, there'll be a trigeminal. You do that in the brainstem. Then when it reaches the thalamus, we get the third order neurons that radiate to the cortex, right? There's a chart. Is that a question? Is there a way you can simplify a bit? Okay. So what I was saying is we have ascending pathways and descending pathways. Ascending pathways are mostly sensory. The one that we are describing here, which we are calling the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, this is a pathway that carries fine touch, or basically discriminative touch of vibration and conscious proprioception, right? So what this column does is spinal cord is starting from lower down going up. That's how we are interpreting it. So you start by having fibers from the lower body more central. And as you go up, you add fibers from the upper body on the outside. So they create this fasciculus, which we call fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus cuneatus. What is in these two fasciculi? It's basically the sensations of fine touch, vibration, pressure, and proprioception. Whilst in the spinal cord, these fibers remain on the same side. Why are we talking about side? The other time we said that the right brain interprets information from the left body. The left brain will interpret information from the right body. So if you're getting sensations coming from the right body, they need to go to the left brain. That is why they're going to decassette. So if these fibers are on the left like this, okay, this is right. If they're on the right, they need to go to the left brain. So what is going to happen? For this pathway, it will decassette, but where it decassettes, it only gets to decassette in the medulla. Unlike the other pathways that I'm going to describe shortly, this one will decassette in the medulla. The medulla is the one that is continuous with the spinal cord at your foramen magnum. If you remember the foramina in the head and neck. So this one, the first order neuron is the one in the spinal cord. I remember I said the first order neuron is a neuron that brings information from the periphery to the cord, to the CNS rather. Then the second order neuron is the one that decassettes. So second order neuron is this one, where the internal arcuate fibers are decassetting. Don't worry about the technical terms for now. I understand where you guys are coming from. The decassetting fibers is the second order neuron that ends in the thalamus. Then from the thalamus, I get a third order neuron, which goes to the cortex, what you guys perceive as the brain, though it's not really the brain, it's just a part of it. Right? I hope I've simplified it. This is the most important ascending pathway, together with, let me show you the other one, together with this that we call the spinothalamic. Spinothalamic, for your level, we just say it carries pain and temperature fibers. Don't worry about other funny things. I know that it's there. I know you talk about pressure, non-discriminative touch, what. Let's just say pain and temperature. right? So this spinothalamic, spino means it's coming from the spinal cord, thalamic it's going up. So this is an ascending tract. It's going to carry sensations of pain and temperature. So this one, unlike, so let's look at this diagram. Unlike the dorsal column that we just talked about, the spinothalamic, what happens is when it enters the spinal cord, at the level of entry, so don't quote me wrong, I'm trying to make it simple. At the level of entry, this spinothalamic will cross to the opposite side. Remember, we said these fibers have to cross at some point. So dorsal column in the spinal cord was ascending on the same side. Then it would only cross in the medulla. But spinothalamic, what happens is at the point of entry in the spinal cord, it will cross to the opposite side, then ascend on the side of the brain where it's supposed to go. This explains the spinal cord syndromes I taught you the last time. Those spinal cord syndromes, I said, if you get a lesion, a hemisection, if you cut half the spinal cord, though not possible, the brown sequard became popular with South African armed robbers. You know, they'll just step someone. That's how this syndrome was well described. So for pain and temperature, imagine I cut on this left side. I will lose pain and temperature sensations on the right. Why? Because the fibers that are coming from the left have already crossed to go to the right. So when you're in the spinal cord, those fibers are already moving on the opposite side, as opposed to the dorsal column, which remains on the same side in the spinal cord and will only cross when it gets to the medulla. Are you guys there, or you want me to repeat?
Please repeat.
Okay. Spinothalamic. Spinothalamic is carrying pain and temperature, right? And remember I said we have 3 sets of neurons. The first order neuron carries the sensation towards the spinal cord, right? But for spinothalamic, it decussets in the spinal cord. It crosses to the opposite side in the spinal cord, so that when it ascends to the brain, it ascends on the side where interpretation is. So if it's coming from the left body, it has to be interpreted on the right brain, right? So the second order neuron for the spinothalamic is actually in the spinal cord, because I say the second order neuron is the one that decussets. So this is the second order neuron, the blue going to yellow here. It decussets whilst in the spinal cord, such that the spinothalamic fibers that are in the spinal cord on the right side, for example, they are carrying pain and temperature from the left body, whilst the spinothalamic fibers in the same spinal cord on the left, they'll be carrying pain and temperature fibers from the right body. Right. Then if you want to be fancy, the second order neuron for spinothalamic originates in the nucleus proprius. Remember I said that the gray matter of the spinal cord is laminated. We have Rex lamina. So we have something called the nucleus proprius, but I wouldn't expect you guys to remember this for now. Let's just get the basics, right? So the reason why we are calling this lateral spinothalamic is, if we come back to that diagram that I started off with here, no, not this one, the one that I had, didn't have this one. Right. Remember the white matter is divided into an anterior column, a lateral column, then a dorsal column. Right. So in the anterior column, there's something called an anterior spinothalamic. In the lateral column, there's something called a lateral spinothalamic. So there are 2 spinothalamics. There's an anterior and there's a lateral. What I've been describing to you is the lateral spinothalamic tract. Right. And this lateral spinal thalamic tract is the one that I said it's pain and temperature. It crosses at the level of entry in the spinal cord. Only after you've understood that, then you can start adding fancy things. So this spinal thalamic can either ascend 1 or 2 segments up or descend 1 or 2 segments down the spinal cord before decussating. And when it does that, it creates something called the dorsolateral tract of Lissois. Right? But let's not talk about that for now. Right? Let's just say it decussates at the point of entry. But it can either just ascend 1 or 2 segments up, or it can even descend 1 or 2 segments down on the same side before it crosses. Right? Then this is the anterior spinal thalamic tract. This is not usually talked about, but for your purpose, just remember that it's mostly for pressure. That's the general teaching. Of course, we also then say it's for crude touch. Remember, I say the dorsal columns are fine touch. You know, fine touch is where you can tell like the specifics of the things that I've touched you. Crude touch basically is probably girls will know what crude touch is, because girls have finer hands. They know like what fine touch is, but crude touch is it's a bit rough. It's a bit primitive. This is what the baboons have. I don't like what differentiates us from baboons basically is maybe not baboons per se, but the lower animals in terms of touch, they have the crude touch aspect. We have the fine touch with the brain. That's why when you're going to do the brain, you're going to find that your hand is mapped on the brain more than any other part of the body. The brain and the genitals. That explains the fine touch aspect, right? So anterior spinal thalamic, I just want you guys to know that it's for crude touch and pressure. Crude touch is what we call non-discriminative touch, but when you say non-discriminative touch, this becomes really too technical for starters, right? The pathway is the same. It's going to decussate at the point of entry, right? Then these ones are a bit hard for you since you haven't done the brainstem, but within the brainstem, there's something called the reticular formation, right? So I'll take you through that a bit. So imagine you want to sleep, like myself, I'm quite sleepy right now, I'm tired. So the brain that is thinking somehow needs to stop. Not necessarily die, but just stop most activities. Something called the reticular formation. It's actually called the reticular activating the RAS system, reticular ascending activating system. So that reticular system actually is sending pathways to the brain right now when you are alert, right? So if it stops, you basically sleep. That's okay. It's not a final detail, but it's just an idea. So imagine pain. If you have been in excruciating pain, you don't sleep. The reason for that is some of the ascending spinal thalamic. So this is put under just after spinal thalamic because it's almost the same. Some of the ascending spinal thalamic fibers, as they're going up the brainstem, instead of going to the thalamus first, they will go to the reticular formation. And what are they going to do when they go to the reticular formation? They are going to activate the reticular formation, the RAS. What are you going to do when you activate that RAS? The RAS is going to send the radiating fibers to the whole brain, the whole cortex. So you're not going to sleep because you're going to experience an excruciating pain. Right. So back then they used to think that if you remove someone's brain, they don't perceive pain. And they realized that no, since these fibers first go to, remember I said all sensations go to the thalamus. The thalamus can also perceive the pain. The only problem is it can't localize it to say where is the pain coming from. That's where the cortex comes into play to say, yeah, the pain is on the left leg. The thalamus can perceive some of that pain, and it's through these spinal thalamic and spinal reticular fibers, right? And where the spinal reticular fibers will go to the thalamus, it's a different set of nuclei. I will not talk about this nuclei now because it's a bit hard for you if you haven't done the thalamus, right? Spinocerebellar. So remember I said the dorsal column carry conscious proprioception. That was a catch, eh? If you say something is conscious, then there has to be unconscious. So right now, um, you don't know where your heart is. You don't know where your organs are. You don't know what's happening at muscle level right now, right? So there has to be unconscious proprioception, the things that you don't need to know that are happening, right? This spinocerebellar tract can be a whole 1 hour discussion because it goes back to the Golgi tendons, the muscle spindles, the gamma motor neurons, what. But what I want you to know for now is they carry unconscious proprioception. There are two of them. There's what we call the posterior, there's what we call the anterior spinocerebellar tracts. They're both found in the lateral column of the in this side there of the spinal cord. And why we call them anterior and posterior is they originate in different levels of the spinal cord. So the posterior spinocerebellar, it's only present above L3. It originates from something called the Clark's column. Someone was asking me about nuclei of the spinal cord. Here is one, the Clark's column. It gives rise to the posterior spinocerebellar. The anterior spinocerebellar, on the other hand, it originates just below that. It originates just below L3. Right? That's the ventral rather, or the anterior. I don't want you to know this for now, but you need to know it when you're done neuro. From the brainstem, there are three pathways going into the cerebellum. So the lowest part of the brainstem, which you call the medulla, connects to the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The middle part, which is the pons, communicates with the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle. The most rostral part, which is the midbrain, communicates with the cerebellum via the superior cerebellar peduncle. So this posterior spinocerebellar tract will communicate with the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And one thing that I want you to know about this tract is the cerebellum is ipsilateral. Unlike the other tracts which we said are going to cross, these ones do not cross. If they make a mistake of crossing, they will cross back to their original side, as happens with this tract here. The ventral spinocerebellar makes a mistake of crossing whilst in the spinal cord, but when it gets to the brainstem, it will cross back to go to the same side where it came from, so that you can, by the end of the day, you say that the cerebellum controls the same side of the body where it is. The right cerebellum will control the right body. The left cerebellum will control the left body. Unlike all the other tracts that were going to the brain, they had to dig a set. So ventral spinocerebellar will only enter the cerebellum using the superior cerebellar peduncle. So it goes all the way up the brainstem. But the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, also called posterior spinocerebellar tract, enters the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Right. Don't worry much about the details about the cerebellum. We'll do that. Spinotectal. So spinal means it's coming from the spinal cord, right? Tectal means it's going to the tectum of the brain, right? For now, I think I'll just be okay with you guys knowing that spinotectal, spinal means spinal cord, tectal, it's going to the tectum of the body. I'll be okay with you guys just knowing that for now. We'll talk about this when we do the midbrain, where we talk about the tectum. Right? This has to do with some of the reflexes that are there within the system. Spinal olivary, This one, so the olivary nuclei, the olivary nuclei are found in the medulla. They communicate with the cerebellum. So somehow this spino-olivary tract has almost the same function as the spinocerebellar tracts that I talked about. Right? The spino-olivary tract. Olivary is just going to the olivary nuclei in the brainstem, medulla to be specific. And to be specific, it's the inferior olivary nucleus. Why am I saying inferior? Because the superior olivary nucleus is involved in hearing. So we'll talk about superior olivary nucleus when we do the hearing pathways. But don't worry much about this. Spinal reticular, I think I've talked about this. This is now the pain fibers that are now going to the reticular formation. They create this ascending reticular activating system, which keeps you up for pain. Right? You won't sleep. I'm sure some of you guys have had some pain where you don't sleep. Right. So I'll give you a recap of these ascending pathways in the 4 minutes that are remaining for this session. So I say that we have the dorsal columns. So I'll now be using this diagram. So I said we have the dorsal columns. The dorsal columns are carrying fine touch and proprioception from the same side of the body. In the spinal cord, they ascend on that side. They will only cross in the medulla. So that's in the brainstem, right? Then I say that we have what we call spinothalamic. The lateral spinothalamic being more talked about. It's in the lateral column. It carries pain and temperature. This lateral spinothalamic will cross at the point of entry in the spinal cord, such that as it goes up, it's now on the opposite side of the body where the sensations came from. Then I say there's also an anterior spinothalamic, which I say this one will carry um, crude touch and vibrations, or basically pressure. Right. Then we talked about the spinocerebellar tracts. These ones carry unconscious proprioception to the cerebellum. And these ones, I say they're unique in that they carry these to the cerebellum on the same side of the body where they came from. So these fibers are uncrossed. But I went further to tell you that the posterior spinocerebellar tract is purely uncrossed. But when you look at the ventral spinocerebellar tract, also known as the anterior spinocerebellar tract, this tract will make a mistake of crossing at some point in the spinal cord, but when it reaches the level of the superior cerebellar peduncle, it is going to cross again to go to the same side where it came from, making it an ipsilateral tract again. So tracts that are going to the cerebellum have to remain ipsilateral because the cerebellum will control the same side of the body. Then I say that we also have something called the spinal olivary. So I think you can see that it's not included on this picture here, meaning it's a very minor tract. The same can be said for the spinotectal. The same can be said for the spinal reticulum. Those are quite minor tracts. The major ascending tracts that we talk about are the dorsal columns. Then we talk about the spinothalamic. Then we talked about the spinocerebellum. The other concept that I want you to remember are the neurons. I say that there's a first order neuron that is coming from the periphery to the central nervous system. Then the one that decussates is the second order neuron. Never make a mistake to say that the neuron after the first synapse is the second order neuron. No, because we have some sensations that actually synapse in this dorsal root ganglion spinal cord, then enter the spinal cord, then do not decussate there. So it will still be a first order neuron. Second order neuron is the neuron that decussates and it reaches the thalamus. Third order neuron is the neuron from the thalamus to the cortex. Right? First order neuron, periphery to the CNS. CNS can mean spinal cord, brainstem, brain, anything. Second order neuron is the one that decussates and goes to the thalamus. Third order neuron is the one that comes from the thalamus and radiates to the cortex. The issue of radiation will become important because I'm sure you know about pain. if pain didn't radiate, some of the things that we do with pain or perceive with pain would not be possible, right? But this gives us a picture of